And siblings and I, we moved to Venice in 1963. We've always been affiliated because Santa Monica and Venice were sister brother cities, although we had our rivalries when we were growing up because all the girls in Santa Monica liked the bad boys in Venice. That was just the way it was. Having grown up in Venice, I've seen and been a part of a lot of changes in the Venice community. I became very active in Venice and social justice issues in '63 and '64, which was the beginning of the civil rights movement and the marches. And one of the things that we were fighting for in the Venice community was jobs, job training, better education, and housing, low-income housing for people in the community. After many years of efforts, we were able to get the low-income housing, the 15 low-income apartment buildings that still exist in Venice today. They were initially 8 were built in 1970, and we celebrated that as one of the first low-income housing developments built in the state of California and in the country that didn't look like projects. We were very proud of that. That housing stayed low income with a 30-year lease from HUD, and then they extended it additional 5 years. And after that additional 5 years, the housing became market rate, which meant that people that were living there could continue to live there. But when they moved out, then the apartment building could be rented at the current market rate. The problem with that is that there were strategies enacted to force people to move out. So new rules were put in place, like if you had a criminal record, no matter how old it was or when it began, even if it preceded the time that you actually moved in the apartment, or if it happened after you had moved in the apartment, you could no longer qualify to rent the apartment. So when you had your annual review, if there was any criminal arrest or convictions in your background, you were not allowed to continue to live there. If you had a spouse or anyone else that moved in with you or that was going to move in with you that had a criminal record, you were forbidden or prohibited from renting one of these apartment buildings. And then, of course, Venice community at the time also, if you had around 1995, 96 is when the Injunction came about in the Venice community, where there was the gang injunction, which was part of, as I see now looking back to the day, was part of the design for getting us to where we are now with gentrification in the Venice community. The gang injunction was a destroyer of families. It meant that if you were a member of a gang, you could not associate with anyone else who was a member of a gang. It didn't matter if it was your brother, your cousin, or any relationship. That could get you rearrested and incarcerated. In Venice, because you're a small community with a lot of family members, cousins, and relatives, it became very difficult and almost impossible for people not to associate with each other. So it really was a movement on the part of the police department to break up families, and it was one of the reasons why a lot of the black families moved away and out of Venice. In the meantime, increasing rents was also another reason people moved out of the community. And then there was the infiltration of real estate brokers, architects, and developers. And people that I talk to say, well, Naomi, it was an issue of supply and demand, and so people were selling their houses because the demand was there, and families were getting lots of money to move forward. Yes, I tell people about Mrs. Edwards, who was the librarian for the Venice Library that was then on California Avenue. She lived on Santa Clara. And Mrs. Edwards was offered $300,000 for her house. And that was around I'll say 1997. And that seemed like an awful lot of money to her. I mean, because she had been living in the community for years, she probably spent maybe $30,000 for her home. And so she sold her house. And then a little while later, with a painted white fence and new paint on the house and porch, they sold it for about $500,000. And that was the beginning of the development of what I call the infiltration of real estate market, because they weren't just moving into the community to assimilate or to make it better. They moved into the community to change it. And so when you see the concrete buildings, the glass front boxes that attract a different level of financial and economic ability, it means that the people here cannot afford to live in those places, and so they have to move. Consequently, a few years ago, when the African American population in Venice was around 10 point something percent, it is now about 6% and going down. So I say it sort of as an aside, but it's the truth. When I grew up in Venice, if there was a white person walking in the streets of Venice and they weren't someone that you knew from the beach or from the community, you would stop and say, "Can I help you?" Because you figured that person was lost. Because it just wasn't common to see white individuals or families, as you see today, with their strollers and their dogs walking the community. That is a new phenomenon. I say that they didn't move into the community to assimilate or to try to become a part of the community or to build on it, because you don't move into a place and build a 10-foot fence and put a combination lock on your gate. That locks you inside, that locks everyone else outside. When some of us protested that to the building codes department, who had been walking around Venice with their clipboards and their pens and pencils looking for code violations, when we confronted them with the fact that it's against code to have a 10-foot fence, their response was that people are building those fences because they feel like they need to be protected, that they need to be safe. And that also tied into with the gang injunction policy that had been put in place. So when you start tying all these things together, the gang injunction, the 10-foot fences with the combination locks, with the housing situation, to gentrification and people's inability to stay in or move into their own communities, then it brings us to where we are today. You know, I have to say that I'm a professor. I teach, primarily right now I teach at Baruch College in New York City. I teach the summer session only. And I have a business, Nightingale and Associates, and one of the things in my business is to teach communication. What I do know is that communication is a two-way street. It simply means that you deliver a message, it's decoded or encoded somewhere in that space between you and the person that you are speaking to, and that person hears you or they don't hear you. The only way that you know if that person hears you or not is if you get a response. And you can verify whether that response is what you meant for that person to hear, or if they understood what you really meant, and that's through a feedback. But you cannot communicate effectively unless it is a two-way conversation. Now I'm sitting here talking to you, and this is a one-way conversation, but I'm also inviting you at some point to get in contact with me if you question anything that I have to say. But I believe in dialogue, and I don't think that we're ever going to get any place unless we do have that dialogue. You may not understand or believe what it is that I say, but because I'm a teacher, it's my responsibility to make sure that you're understanding what it is I'm trying to deliver to you. And as a teacher, not only of people who are in master degree programs, but having been a teacher at the high school level, I was not successful until my students were successful. So it meant that anything that I needed to do, if it meant knocking on your door and talking to your parents or keeping you in school at the end of the day to make sure that you understood. And sometimes it meant I had to be a little harsh. it meant that I might have to grab you in your collar, make sure you understand what I'm saying when I say that it's important for you to understand and learn in order for you to be successful in life. But the bottom line, it really boils down to whether or not you want to understand, whether or not you have an open ear and you want to hear what I have to say and try to put yourself in my place. I call it respectful engagement. But I also call it respectful disengagement. And what does that mean? That means at the end of the conversation, when we're not able to agree, that we leave enough space between us so that we can come back to that discussion at another time and maybe approach it in a different way. What has happened in the Venice environment is that there have been people who have not been willing to listen. There have been people who have not cared about what the situation is in Venice as it relates to the preservation of African American contributions and culture in this community. How can you have a community that began in the late 1800s, over 112 years ago, and not have any whatsoever indication in anywhere of the contributions of that community? How can any community anywhere, no matter what color, race, creed, culture, be in existence for that long and have nothing of significance be said about it? That can only be done through purposeful intention. And if you live within that same community, it is only because you closed your eyes and your ears and your mind to what it is that you chose not to see. African Americans in this Venice community, and when I grew up, Venice was a small area, the 1.5 whatever square miles from California north to Rose Avenue, Lincoln Boulevard to the beach. That was Venice for us. It wasn't all of this larger area of Venice, including the Oxford Triangle, including other parts of Venice to the marina, because we